Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight, we talk about the true crime story. Oscar Javier Barbosa was stabbed outside of a YMCA in San Antonio, Texas on February 19th, Ken's reports, citing San Antonio police. On Sunday, March 22nd, Abel Ali Rivas was arrested on charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and possession of a controlled substance in connection with the shooting, the San Antonio Express news reports, citing police. The human heart is a complex cartography of old loyalties and new beginnings, and sometimes the most dangerous paths are the ones we tread when we refuse to let the past remain behind us. We often believe that when a door closes on a relationship, the echoes eventually fade into the quiet corners of memory, leaving room for a stillness that allows us to grow. Yet, there is a particular kind of shadows that lingers in the wake of shared lives. A residual heat that, if left untended, can transform from the warmth of affection into a cold, calculated intent. It is a strange facet of our nature that the people who once knew our rhythms most intimately are the ones capable of orchestrating the most profound disruptions to our peace. Tonight, we find ourselves in the historic, sprawling landscape of San Antonio, Texas, where the air in late winter carries a subtle, lingering humidity and the scent of damp earth and cedar. The city is a patchwork of vibrant culture and quiet residential pockets, where the lights of the skyline shimmer against the horizon, distant and steady. On the evening of February 19th, the sky over the east side was likely transitioning into that deep, bruised purple that precedes a true Texas night. The streets here, like Iowa Street, are lined with the markers of daily life. The low hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog in a fenced yard, and the steady, reassuring presence of community hubs. The grass, perhaps a bit brittle from the seasonal shift, waits for the inevitable return of the spring rains, while the oak trees stand as silent, sturdy witnesses to the movements of the neighborhood. In this setting, we meet Oscar Javier Barbosa, a man whose life was anchored by the simple, profound responsibilities of fatherhood and the tentative, hopeful steps of a new relationship. To understand Oscar is to understand the quiet rhythm of a person trying to build something lasting. He was a man who moved through his days with a sense of purpose, likely finding comfort in the routine of physical activity and the grounding presence of his children. There is a specific kind of peace found in the mundane, the weight of a gym bag over a shoulder, the cool metal of car keys in a pocket, and the familiar sound of a loved one's voice over a telephone line. On this particular February evening, Oscar was at the Davis Scott family YMCA, located at 1213 Iowa Street, a place dedicated to the health and vitality of the community. It is a building that smells of floor wax and determination, a sanctuary where the stresses of the outside world are meant to be sweated away under bright fluorescent lights. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, elegant shadows across the parking lot of the YMCA, Oscar finished his session. We can imagine the transition from the humid, active air of the gym to the crisp, cooling atmosphere of the outdoors. It is a moment of vulnerability that we all experience. The transition from a secure, populated space to the solitude of a vehicle. Oscar was not alone in spirit, however. He was on the phone with his girlfriend, their conversation a bridge of normalcy stretching across the distance between them. This digital tether, meant for connection, would soon become the most critical piece of evidence in an unfolding tragedy. The sound of her voice was the last note of safety in a world that was about to shift beneath his feet. The Davis-Scott YMCA sits as a cornerstone of the Denver Heights neighborhood, a structure that represents stability and self-improvement. But on this night, the periphery of the property held a different kind of energy. While Oscar walked toward his car, the silence of Iowa Street was not as empty as it seemed. In the darkness, plans that had been whispered in private were manifesting into physical reality. There is a heavy stillness that precedes a violent act, a moment where the air feels thick, as if the environment itself is holding its breath. According to the investigation that would later piece these moments together, the architecture of this encounter was not accidental. It was a collision of two separate pasts, woven together by a shared resentment. Melanie Sierra Gomez, the mother of Oscar's two children, was a woman whose life had recently been shadowed by legal complexities. At 32 years old, she was navigating the constraints of probation, having previously dealt with charges involving terroristic threats. The bond between parents is often described as unbreakable, but when that bond frays, it can leave behind a jagged edge. Melanie was not merely a bystander in Oscar's new life. She was, according to the police reports, a central architect in a plot to dismantle it. The geography of her intent stretched beyond her own emotions, reaching out to connect with another individual who harbored his own grievances. This individual was Abel Ali Rivas. In the strange, interconnected web of this case, Rivas occupied a mirror image position to Melanie. He was the ex-boyfriend of the woman Oscar was currently dating. It is a chilling realization to consider how two people, separated by their own histories, could find common ground in the desire to strike back at those who had moved on. The unbelievable plot was not born of a sudden impulse, but rather a slow-burning coordination between two figures from the past who refused to remain there. As Oscar stood in the cooling San Antonio air, his stomach and arms would soon bear the physical marks of this coordinated shadow. The stabbing occurred with a suddenness that contrasted sharply with the slow, methodical planning that preceded it. The violence was found to be targeted and severe, requiring immediate surgical intervention at a nearby hospital. Yet, even in the chaos of the assault, the connection Oscar maintained with his girlfriend via his phone remained active. This detail is haunting. The way technology captures the transition from a peaceful evening to a struggle for survival. The sounds filtered through the receiver, providing the authorities with a real-time map of the event. It was this unintentional recording of a nightmare that would eventually lead the San Antonio Police Department to the doors of Melanie Gomez and Abel Rivas. By the next morning, the quiet of the Davis-Scott YMCA parking lot would be replaced by the methodical movements of crime scene investigators. They would look at the pavement, the proximity of the entrance, and the trajectory of the encounter. But the true story lay in the phone records and the histories of those involved. The investigation would reveal that this was a crime of instruction, a dark pact where one person's grievance became another's weapon. Not long after, the legal system began to close in. Melanie was arrested first, just 5 days after the incident. Her transition from the freedom of the streets to the confines of a jail cell, marking the first chapter of accountability. As we reflect on these opening events, we see a landscape where the mundane and the macabre sit side by side. A community center, a telephone call, a father leaving the gym. These are the textures of a normal life. But beneath that surface, the midnight narrator reminds us that the past is a powerful force. The arrest of Abel Ali Rivas would follow weeks later, but the wounds sustained by Oscar Javier Barbosa would take much longer to heal. We move forward now, away from the immediate heat of the struggle and into the colder, more analytical light of the procedural aftermath. The silence of the night in San Antonio eventually returned, but for those involved, the stillness would never quite feel the same again. The weight of this story lies not just in the act itself, but in the profound betrayal of the social contracts we hold with those we once loved. As the investigation deepened, the full scope of the coordination between Melanie and Abel began to emerge from the digital footprints they left behind. It is a sobering thought that in our modern world, our most private vindications are often written in a language that the law can eventually translate. For now, the hospital corridors where Oscar recovered remained quiet, a stark contrast to the busy streets of Iowa Street, where his life had almost been extinguished. The danger had passed, the suspects were being processed, and the long, slow journey toward justice had begun. To understand how two separate lives converged into a single moment of violence on Iowa Street, we must look at the quiet, often invisible threads of resentment that had been tightening for months. Melanie Sierra Gomez was 32 years old, a mother of 2, and a woman whose personal history had become increasingly entangled with the legal system long before the evening at the Davis-Scott family YMCA. She was not a stranger to the local authorities in San Antonio. Her records painted a picture of a life lived under a simmering pressure. At the time of the incident, Melanie was navigating the complexities of a deferred adjudication, a legal state that usually suggests a final chance to remain in the community under strict supervision. This particular probation stemmed from a charge involving a terroristic threat, an accusation that she had intentionally created a fear of imminent, serious bodily injury in another. It is in these details that we see the first shadows of the alliance to come. The transition from verbal threats to a physical confrontation in a public parking lot did not happen in a vacuum. It was the result of a slow, steady erosion of restraint. While Melanie was managing the dual roles of motherhood and the requirements of her probation, her life remained deeply intertwined with Oscar Javier Barbosa. The two of them were linked by their children, a bond that usually demands a certain level of cooperation and peace. In San Antonio, where the heat of February can still feel like a promise of spring, these two individuals were existing in the delicate aftermath of a long-term relationship. Oscar had begun to build a new life, one that moved in a direction away from the turbulence of his past with Melanie. He had found a new partner, a woman whose own past would inadvertently provide the second piece of a dangerous puzzle. At the same time, across the city, Abel Ali Rivas was existing in his own orbit of discontent. Abel was the ex-boyfriend of the woman Oscar was now dating. The social architecture of San Antonio is often like this. a web of interconnected lives where everyone is separated by only a few degrees of history. Abel, like Melanie, was not living a life of quiet anonymity. When he was eventually taken into custody on March 22nd, the charges against him extended beyond the violence at the YMCA. According to the police records and the reports from the San Antonio Express News, Abel was also found to be in possession of a controlled substance at the time of his arrest. This additional detail provides a glimpse into the chaotic environment he was navigating, one where the boundaries of the law had become blurred long before he ever encountered Oscar Barbosa in a parking lot. The connection between Melanie and Abel was not one of long-standing friendship or professional association. Instead, it was a coalition born of a shared, singular purpose: the disruption of Oscar's newfound stability. They were two people who had once been central to the lives of a new couple, now find themselves on the periphery, watching as life moved forward without them. This shared status as the former created a bridge between them. According to the investigation and the resulting arrest affidavits, the two allegedly began to coordinate their actions. It was an alliance built on the specific geography of their lives. Melanie knew where Oscar would be, and Abel provided the physical means of confrontation. By mid-February, the plans were no longer just spoken threats or quiet resentments. They had taken on a tangible, logistical form. Melanie, despite being under the watchful eye of the court for her previous 2024 charge, allegedly began to facilitate the meeting that would change all their lives. The Davis Scott family YMCA on Iowa Street is a place typically associated with the sounds of basketballs hitting the hardwood, the rhythmic splash of the swimming pool, and the general hum of a community bettering itself. It is a place where families go to feel safe and active. To choose such a location for an assault suggests a level of brazenness that often accompanies a deep-seated sense of entitlement or desperation. As the evening of February 19th approached, the atmosphere in the city remained calm. The palm trees that lined parts of the east side were still in the fading light, and the daily commute was beginning to taper off. Oscar arrived at the YMCA for what he likely believed was a routine visit, perhaps a way to decompress or stay healthy for his children. He was, at the time, on the phone with his new girlfriend. This single act of connection would later become a critical piece of evidence. Through the phone line, the sounds of the evening were transmitted: the closing of a car door, the crunch of gravel, and then the sudden, sharp intrusion of a physical struggle. The investigation would later reveal that the coordination between Melanie and Abel was not a spontaneous outburst. It was viewed by the authorities as an orchestrated event. While Oscar was attempting to move through his evening, he was being watched. The police alleged that Melanie had provided the necessary information, the instruction, as the reports often phrase it, for Abel to carry out the attack. It is a haunting thought. The idea of a person standing in the shadows of a parking lot, waiting for a signal, while another person, miles away or perhaps just around the corner, provides the timing. When the confrontation finally occurred, it was swift and devastating. Oscar was stabbed in the stomach and the arms, wounds that would require immediate and invasive surgery at a nearby hospital. The physical reality of a stabbing is often different from what is portrayed in fiction. It is visceral, quiet, and leaves a heavy silence in its wake. As Oscar fell, the attackers fled, leaving behind a scene that stood in stark contrast to the mission of the YMCA. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of emergency lights and the sterile, bright lights of the trauma center. For Melanie Gomez, the arrest came relatively quickly on February 24th. She was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The jail records from that week show a woman whose life had taken a sharp, final turn away from the path of her probation. She was released on bond on March 4th, but the legal machinery was already moving forward. For Abel Rivas, the period of freedom lasted slightly longer. He remained at large for nearly a month after the incident, a time during which the investigation quietly gathered the threads of his involvement. When the police finally caught up with him on March 22nd, he was processed into the Bexar County Jail with a bond set at $105,000. The alliance between the two exes, one the mother of the victim's children, the other the former partner of his new girlfriend, is a reminder of how the past can cast a long, cooling shadow over the present. The psychological catalyst was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of perceived slights and the inability to let go. As we move further into the details of the case, we begin to see the mundane anchors that defined their lives before the tragedy. The court dates, the childcare arrangements, the small everyday choices that eventually led them to the corner of Iowa Street. The danger had indeed passed by the time the arrests were finalized, and the streets of San Antonio returned to their usual rhythm, leaving only the legal proceedings to untangle the dark plan that had briefly disrupted the peace. Justice was now in the hands of the courts, and the victims were left to heal in the quiet safety of their recovery. The transition from the chaos of the asphalt to the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Bexar County Courthouse marked the beginning of a marathon of litigation. While the physical wounds inflicted upon the victim began the slow process of cicatrization, the legal architecture of the prosecution was just beginning to take shape. To understand the gravity of the $105,000 bond, one must analyze the specific statutory framework of the charges. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. In Texas, this is typically a second-degree felony, but when the context implies a premeditated ambush involving multiple actors, the complexity of the evidentiary discovery increases exponentially. The prosecution's strategy hinged on the digital footprint left by the co-conspirators. In the modern era of criminal investigation, the cooling shadow of the past is often illuminated by the blue light of a smartphone. Detectives began the arduous task of extracting data from encrypted messaging platforms, looking for the specific moment the slow accumulation of slights transitioned into a concrete tactical plan. They weren't just looking for anger, they were looking for logistics. The investigation pivoted toward cell site location information, CSLI. By mapping the pings from local towers, technicians could visualize the movement of the suspects in the hours leading up to the confrontation on Iowa Street. It wasn't merely a chance encounter. The data suggested a predatory pattern, a vehicular stalking that mirrored the emotional obsession driving the suspects. Imagine the scene in the digital forensics lab. rows of monitors displaying heat maps of movement. Each dot represented a decision. A turn onto a side street, a pause near the victim's residence, a frantic burst of communication between the two ex-partners. This wasn't a crime of passion sparked in a momentary lapse of reason. It was a coordinated interception. The vocabulary of the crime shifted from outburst to execution of intent. While the lawyers argued over bail amounts and discovery motions, the victim faced a much more visceral reality. A knife wound to the torso is not a singular event. It is a cascade of physiological crises. When the blade breached the abdominal wall, it didn't just cause pain. It disrupted the homeostasis of the entire body. Medical records entered into the discovery phase detailed the mundane anchors of post-operative life. The victim's existence was now measured in milliliters of drainage, the calibration of pain medication, and the agonizingly slow return of motor function. Every cough felt like a structural failure of the surgical staples. This is where the true weight of the crime resides. Not in the dramatic, shining blade of a novelist's prose, but in the grueling, unglamorous labor of survival. The victim's new girlfriend, also a survivor of this psychological warfare, found herself navigating a landscape of secondary trauma. She had to manage the childcare arrangements mentioned earlier, but now under the crushing pressure of hypervigilance. Every knock on the door, every car idling too long at the curb, triggered the sympathetic nervous system. The quiet safety described by the media was, in reality, a fortress of locked deadbolts and frequent glances at the rearview mirror. The bond between the two suspects, linked by their shared resentment, is a study in toxic synergy. Criminologists often point to discretization, where individuals who might never commit a violent act alone find the social permission to do so when paired with a like-minded agitator. The catalyst. One partner provides the logistical information, addresses, schedules, habits. The enforcer. The other provides the physical initiative, the rationalization. Together, they create a feedback loop where the victim is dehumanized, transformed from a person into a problem that needs to be solved. In the interrogation rooms, the narrative of the perceived slights began to crumble under the weight of objective facts. When confronted with the timeline of their movements, the suspects could no longer rely on the defense of a random escalation. The prosecution pointed to the acquisition of the weapon. Was it a household tool grabbed in haste, or an item purchased specifically for this encounter? The answer to that question often determines the difference between a decade in prison and a lifetime. Iowa Street, for a brief window in time, became a crime scene, but for the residents, it remained home. The yellow tape eventually fell away, and the bloodstains were scoured from the pavement. But the collective memory of a neighborhood remains resilient. Neighbors who witnessed the struggle provided the initial accounts that anchored the police reports. Their testimonies painted a picture of a suburban environment shattered by a sudden, jarring eruption of private malice. One witness described the sound of the confrontation, not as a cinematic scream, but as a series of heavy, wet thuds followed by the screech of tires. It was the sound of a plan failing to be clean. The attackers had hoped for a swift disappearance, but they underestimated the alertness of a community that refuses to be a backdrop for domestic vendettas. As the court date approached, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office began refining the theory of the case. They needed to convince a jury that the $105,000 bond was justified because the defendants represented a continued threat to the community. They focused on the cooling shadow, arguing that if these individuals were willing to coordinate such a violent ambush over past relationships, their capacity for future violence was a matter of public record, not just private history. The defense, conversely, attempted to humanize the suspects. They looked into the small, everyday choices that preceded the event, trying to find a narrative of desperation or mental instability. They argued that the alliance was not a conspiracy, but a tragic convergence of two people pushed to their breaking point. However, the physical evidence was hard to ignore. The knife, the blood spatter patterns, and the GPS data formed a triad of proof that suggested a high level of cognitive function and deliberation. You don't accidentally track an ex-partner's new boyfriend to a specific corner on Iowa Street. We often talk about the emotional cost, but the economic destruction is just as profound. The victim, unable to work during his recovery, faced a mountain of medical debt. In the United States, a single traumatic injury can result in hundreds of thousands of dollars in hospital bills. The $105,000 bond set for the suspect is a fraction of the total economic impact of the crime. This leads to a broader discussion of restorative justice versus retributive justice. While the suspects sat in the Bexar County Jail, the victim's family had to organize fundraisers and navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of victim compensation funds. The rhythm of the streets might have returned to normal, but the rhythm of the victim's bank account was permanently disrupted. The specific dynamic of an ex-partner teaming up with the new partner's ex is a rare but documented phenomenon in domestic violence circles. It's called proximate stalking. It's an attempt to regain control not just over an individual, but over a narrative. By attacking the new partner, the aggressors are attempting to reset the timeline to a point where they still held influence. Psychological evaluations entered into the court record hinted at a shared delusional framework. They convinced each other that they were the true victims and that the man on Iowa Street was the interloper who had stolen their happiness. This inversion of reality is what allowed them to justify the violence. It wasn't an assault in their minds. It was a reclamation. The script previously mentioned court dates and childcare arrangements. These are not just background details. They are the scaffolding of the motive. In the weeks leading up to March 22nd, every interaction regarding the children became a trigger. A late drop-off, a missed text message, or a new car in the driveway were all interpreted as a personal insult. The detectives who worked the case were struck by the normality of the suspects' lives. They were not career criminals or people living on the margins. They were neighbors, parents, and workers. This is the most chilling aspect of the crime on Iowa Street. The fact that mundane anchors can so easily be transformed into weapons of war. By the time the prosecution was ready, the file was thousands of pages thick. It contained ballistic reports, digital forensics, eyewitness statements, and medical evaluations. The dark plan had been laid bare. It was a story of a collision, a metaphorical and literal one, between two worlds that should have remained separate. The victims of the attack on Iowa Street are not just survivors. They are participants in a long, grueling marathon toward justice. The legal proceedings continue to unfold, with each motion and hearing adding another layer to the narrative. The streets of San Antonio are indeed peaceful now, but for those who were there, the long, cooling shadow of that day will never truly dissipate. The trial date has been set, and the prosecution is preparing to present the digital evidence that could change the suspect's $105,000 bond to a much more permanent sentence. Would you like me to dive deeper into the specific digital forensics or the medical recovery journey of the victim?